There's a reason your boss can't just hit you when you mess up at work. A reason your neighbor can't claim your house by planting their flag in your yard. A reason a stranger can't marry your daughter without asking anyone. But for most of human history, none of those rules existed. And the people who made that system, they did it without a single soldier. No armies, no police, no guns. Just words, just ideas. And somehow, they controlled millions. This is the story of how ancient rulers made you police yourself, punish yourself, and believe it was all your idea. And the scariest part? Some of these systems are still running today. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that everything you think you own, you don't. Your house belongs to whoever's stronger, your kids can be taken, your work means nothing. That's not a dystopia, that's just Tuesday in the year 2000 BC. For almost all of human history, there was no law stopping someone from just taking your stuff, or you. But then, something changed. Someone figured out how to stop chaos without hiring a single guard. They created something more powerful than swords. They created belief systems. And once you believed, you were controlled. The first rulers didn't have armies big enough to watch everyone. Egypt's pharaohs had maybe a few thousand soldiers to control millions of people spread across hundreds of miles. The math doesn't work. You can't have a guard on every corner. You can't watch every farmer, every merchant, every slave. So they didn't even try. Instead, they made you afraid of something that wasn't even there. They made you afraid of the gods. And here's the thing. They didn't ask you to fear the gods in general. They made you fear what would happen if you broke very specific rules, rules that conveniently kept them in power. In ancient Egypt, there was a law that said if you didn't help build the pyramids during flood season, the gods would curse your afterlife. Not the pharaoh, the gods. And everyone believed it. So millions of people showed up every year to drag stones in the heat, not because soldiers forced them, but because they were terrified of dying wrong. The punishment wasn't physical, it was spiritual. And you couldn't fight it. You couldn't rebel against a curse. That's genius. That's control without violence. And it gets darker. The pharaohs had priests who would walk through villages and record who showed up for labor and who didn't. But here's the setup. The priests didn't threaten you with arrest. They threatened you with something worse. They said your name would be erased from the temple records, which meant the gods wouldn't know you existed when you died. You'd be forgotten forever. In a culture where the afterlife was everything, where your entire existence depended on being remembered, that threat was worse than death. So people worked, not because they were forced, but because they were more afraid of being forgotten than being exploited. Now think about what that means. The pharaohs created a system where the punishment happened after you were dead. You couldn't verify it, you couldn't escape it, you couldn't even see it coming, but you believed it anyway, and that belief made you obedient. That's not law enforcement, that's psychological warfare, and it worked for 3,000 years. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1750 BC, is one of the oldest law systems we've ever found. Everyone talks about an eye for an eye, but they don't tell you the other part. The code didn't treat everyone equally. If a nobleman killed a commoner's son, he didn't lose his own son, he paid a fine. If a commoner killed a nobleman's son, they executed the commoner's son instead. The system wasn't about justice, it was about keeping classes separate. The law itself told you that you were worth less, and you couldn't argue with it because it was written in stone, literally, carved into a giant pillar in the center of the city where everyone could see it. The law was the truth because it was permanent, because it was public, because everyone else accepted it. But here's what's really disturbing. Hammurabi's code had 282 laws, and most of them weren't about crime. They were about debt, about contracts, about what happens when you owe someone money and can't pay. The punishment? You became their slave, you or your family, for years, sometimes forever. The system wasn't designed to stop theft or murder. It was designed to trap you in economic bondage, and it was legal, publicly displayed, celebrated as justice. People would walk past that stone pillar every day and think, this is how things should be. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Hammurabi didn't invent these laws, he just wrote them down. Most of them were already customs, already accepted, already normal, which means people were enslaving each other for debt long before it was official. The law didn't create the cruelty, it just made it permanent, it gave it legitimacy. And once something is written down, once it's official, it becomes a lot harder to question.
because now you're not just disagreeing with a person, you're disagreeing with the system, and the system doesn't negotiate. But here's where it gets strange. These ancient law systems didn't just control actions, they controlled thought. In ancient China, Confucius didn't create a legal code, he created a social code. He said that if you respect your parents, your elders, your ruler, then society works. If you don't, everything falls apart. No punishment needed, just shame, just dishonor. And that shame was worse than prison, because prison ends, shame follows you forever. Your family carries it, your kids inherit it, so you police yourself. You bow, you obey, you stay in line, not because someone's watching, but because everyone might be watching. And that's the trick.
Confucius taught something called filial piety. It meant total obedience to your parents. Not respect, obedience. You couldn't question them, you couldn't disobey them, even if they were wrong, even if they were cruel, because the family structure was sacred, and if you broke it, you weren't just a bad son, you were a threat to civilization itself. The punishment wasn't legal, it was social. Your neighbors would shun you, your friends would abandon you, you'd be unmarriageable, unemployable, invisible. And that invisibility was enforced by everyone around you, not by guards or courts, but by regular people who believed the system was right. Ancient Rome took this even further. They had laws, sure, but they also had something called mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. It wasn't written down, it wasn't official, but everyone knew it. And if you violated it, you were socially destroyed. Your reputation was gone, you couldn't do business, you couldn't marry well, you were invisible. The Romans didn't need to arrest you, they just stopped seeing you. And that was enough, because in a society where your identity is tied to your status, losing status is worse than losing your life. You become a ghost, and people would do anything to avoid that. Roman society had something called infamia. It was a legal label for people who lost their honor. Actors, gladiators, prostitutes, anyone who broke certain social rules. If you were labeled infamia, you couldn't vote, you couldn't testify in court, you couldn't hold office. But here's the thing, you didn't go to trial for it. There was no defense, no appeal. You just were infamia. And once you were, you stayed that way. Your kids inherited it, your grandkids inherited it. The punishment didn't end with you, it was generational. And the system made sure everyone knew who you were. Your name was published, your status was public, you wore your shame like a brand. Now, here's the part no one talks about. These systems didn't just control the poor, they controlled the rich too. In medieval Europe, kings didn't have standing armies, they had vassals, lords who owned land and owed loyalty. But here's the setup. The king gave you land, and in return, you gave him soldiers when he needed them. Sounds fair, except the contract was a ceremony, a ritual. You kneeled, you swore an oath, you kissed his ring. And once you did that, breaking the oath wasn't just illegal, it was spiritual betrayal. You were damned, and everyone you knew would turn on you. So even the powerful were trapped. They couldn't rebel without losing everything, not to the king's army, but to the system of belief they helped create. The feudal oath was called homage, and it wasn't just words, it was a performance. You placed your hands between the king's hands, you swore on the Bible, you declared yourself his man, and everyone watched. Witnesses, nobles, priests, the ceremony was designed to be unforgettable, because once you did it, you couldn't deny it. You couldn't say you didn't mean it. You couldn't back out. The oath became your identity, and if you broke it, you weren't just a traitor to the king, you were a traitor to God, to society, to yourself. The punishment was eternal damnation, and everyone believed it. Even the people who broke their oaths believed it. They knew they were damned, and they did it anyway. There's a reason we call it social contract theory, because that's what it's always been. A contract you didn't sign, but you're bound to anyway. And the most effective rulers in history understood this. They didn't rule by force. They ruled by making you believe the system was natural, inevitable, divine. They made the rules feel older than they actually were. They made you think this is just how things are. And once you believe that, you stop asking why. You stop resisting. You just exist inside it. Let's talk about the caste system in ancient India. It wasn't enforced by soldiers, it was enforced by religion. The Vedic texts said that people were born into their roles. Brahmins were priests, Kshatriyas were warriors, Vaishyas were merchants, Shudras were laborers, and below them, the untouchables. You couldn't move up, you couldn't change. It was cosmic law. And if you tried to break it, you weren't just punished in this life, you were punished in the next one. Reincarnation wasn't hope, it was a threat. Behave now or come back as something worse. That's not a legal system. That's a prison with infinite sentences. The caste system had rules about everything: who you could eat with, who you could touch, who you could marry, what jobs you could do, what water you could drink from. And these weren't suggestions, they were cosmic requirements. If a Brahmin touched an untouchable, they had to perform purification rituals. If an untouchable entered a temple, they could be beaten or killed, not by the government, by anyone, because maintaining the caste system was everyone's responsibility. The enforcement was distributed, decentralized. Everyone was a guard, everyone was a judge, and the punishment was both immediate and eternal. Here's the question no one wants to answer. Why did people accept this? Why didn't they revolt? And the answer is, some did, but most didn't, because the system gave them something too. It gave them certainty, it gave them identity, it told them where they belonged, and humans crave that. Even if it's a cage, if it's a familiar cage, most people stay inside, because the unknown is scarier than the unfair.
But there's another reason. The system promised that if you accepted your suffering now, you'd be rewarded later, next life, next incarnation. Your obedience would be recorded, your karma would improve. You'd move up, eventually. Maybe not this life, maybe not the next, but someday. That promise kept people obedient for thousands of years because the reward was always just out of reach, always one more lifetime away. And you couldn't prove it was a lie. You couldn't verify it. You just had to believe. And if you didn't believe, well, that was your choice and your punishment. The ancient Mayans had a system where the king was considered a living god, not a representative of the gods, not chosen by the gods. He was a god. So when he made a law, it wasn't up for debate. You didn't protest divine will. And here's the thing. The king didn't need to prove he was a god. He just needed everyone else to believe it. And they did, because the alternative was chaos. If the king isn't a god, then who's in charge? If the system isn't sacred, then what's stopping your neighbor from killing you? People believed because not believing was too dangerous. Mayan kings performed bloodletting rituals in public. They would pierce their tongues, their genitals, and let the blood drip onto sacred paper. Then they'd burn the paper and claim they were communicating with the gods. And everyone watched, everyone believed. Because if the king was willing to torture himself in public, he must be telling the truth. The pain was proof. The sacrifice was proof. And once people accepted that the king could talk to gods, they accepted everything else, his laws, his taxes, his wars. Because you don't question someone who bleeds for the gods. Fast forward to the Aztecs. They had laws about tribute. Every city they conquered had to send goods, resources, people. But they didn't station soldiers in every city. They didn't have enough. Instead, they made an example. One city rebels, they destroy it, publicly, brutally. And suddenly, every other city pays up. Not because they're being watched, but because they watched what happened to the ones who didn't comply. Fear doesn't need to be constant, it just needs to be memorable. The Aztecs had a practice called the Flower Wars. They would arrange battles with neighboring cities, not to conquer them, but to capture prisoners. And those prisoners would be sacrificed, publicly, on top of pyramids, in front of thousands of people. The message was clear: resist us, and this is your fate. But here's the darker part. The Flower Wars were scheduled, agreed upon. Both sides participated willingly, because both sides needed prisoners for their own sacrifices. The violence wasn't chaos, it was organized, ritualized, and everyone accepted it as normal, as necessary, as the way things should be. Now let's ask a darker question. Are we still doing this? Are modern systems just ancient control methods with better marketing? Think about it. We have laws we didn't vote on, rules we didn't agree to, and we follow them. Not because police are everywhere. Most people will never interact with a cop. We follow them because we've internalized the system. We police ourselves. We shame each other. We ostracize people who don't fit. We call it civilization, but what if it's just the same ancient trick dressed up in modern language? Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Every society has unwritten rules that are stronger than written ones. You can't say certain things. You can't ask certain questions, not because it's illegal, but because you'll be exiled, canceled, erased. The method is different. The result is the same. You stay in line, not because you're afraid of jail, but because you're afraid of being alone. And that's the oldest control system in the book. Ancient Babylon had something called the Eye of the King. It was a network of informants, regular people who reported on their neighbors. And the trick was, you never knew who was an informant, so you assumed everyone was. You watched what you said, you watched what you did. You policed yourself because the threat of being watched was enough. You didn't need actual surveillance, you just needed the belief that surveillance was possible. Sound familiar? The Eye of the King system worked because it made trust impossible. You couldn't confide in your friends, you couldn't complain to your family, because anyone could be reporting back. And the punishments for disloyalty were severe, not just for you, for everyone you knew. Your family could be enslaved, your property seized, your name erased from records. So people stayed silent, they smiled, they obeyed. Not because they wanted to, but because the cost of resistance was too high. And the beauty of the system from the king's perspective was that it required almost no resources, no guards, no prisons, just fear. And fear is free. There's a text from ancient Persia that describes how King Darius controlled his empire. He didn't travel to every city, he didn't have soldiers in every province, he had roads, fast roads, and a message system. If a governor somewhere stepped out of line, the king would know in days, and the punishment would arrive in weeks. The speed of information was the weapon. It made distance irrelevant. It made rebellion pointless, because by the time you tried, he already knew. The Persian road system was called the Royal Road. It stretched over 1,500 miles, and it had stations every 15 miles where messengers could change horses. A message could travel from one end of the empire to the other in 7 days. For context, that same journey would take a normal traveler 3 months. The speed created the illusion of omnipotence. The king couldn't be everywhere, but his knowledge could. And that knowledge was power, because if you knew the king would find out, you didn't rebel, you didn't steal, you didn't scheme, you just obeyed. The threat of punishment was enough. The punishment itself rarely needed to happen.
The thing about ancient control systems is that they were efficient, brutally efficient. Modern governments spend billions on police, military, surveillance. Ancient rulers spent almost nothing. They built belief systems that made people control themselves. And the wildest part? Those belief systems outlasted the rulers. The Egyptian Empire is gone, but people still believe in the afterlife. The Roman Empire is gone, but we still value honor and reputation. The Vedic rulers are gone, but the caste system survived for thousands of years. The control didn't need the controller. It became self-sustaining. There's a concept in psychology called internalized oppression. It's when you enforce the rules of your oppressor even when they're not around, even when they're dead. You carry the prison inside you. And ancient rulers understood this instinctively. They didn't just want you to obey, they wanted you to believe that obedience was right, that the system was fair, that your suffering had meaning. Because if you believed that, you'd never rebel. You'd defend the system, even against your own interests. Let's talk about ancient Sparta. Everyone knows about their warriors, but not everyone knows how they controlled the helots, the slave class that outnumbered Spartans 7-1. They couldn't guard that many people, so they didn't. Instead, they had a practice called the Cryptia. Young Spartan men would be sent out at night to hunt helots, randomly, without warning. The goal wasn't to kill all of them, just enough to keep the fear alive, to remind them that any night could be their last, that obedience was survival. The Cryptia wasn't punishment for a crime, it was terrorism, state-sponsored, ritualized, and it worked. The helots stayed obedient for centuries, not because they couldn't fight back. They had the numbers, they had the strength, but they didn't have the organization. They didn't have the belief that they could win. And without that belief, rebellion was suicide. So they worked, they served, they died quietly, and the Spartans maintained control without a massive army, just fear, just violence, just enough to keep everyone in line. So here's the final question. If ancient rulers could control millions without armies, just by shaping belief, just by creating invisible rules, who's shaping your beliefs right now? What invisible rules are you following without questioning? What systems are you defending because you think they're natural, when really they were designed? And the most unsettling part, would you even know if you were being controlled? Think about the rules you follow every day, the ones you don't even notice. Stand in line, don't cut, pay your taxes, show up on time, respect authority, don't ask too many questions. Most of these aren't laws, they're customs, social expectations. And you follow them not because someone's forcing you, but because everyone else is following them. And if you don't, you're the weird one, the difficult one, the one who doesn't belong. That's not freedom, that's obedience, voluntary obedience, and it's the most powerful kind. Ancient rulers didn't need to watch you, they just needed you to watch yourself. They didn't need to punish you, they needed you to fear punishment. They didn't need to control your actions, they needed to control your thoughts. And once they did that, once you believed the system was right, was natural, was inevitable, you became your own prison guard. You enforced the rules on yourself. You judged yourself by their standards. You measured your worth by their metrics. And you did it willingly, eagerly, because you thought it was your idea. The scariest part isn't that ancient systems were cruel. It's that they were effective and efficient and elegant. They didn't require violence or surveillance or massive infrastructure. They just required belief. And once that belief took root, it grew on its own. It spread through families, through communities, through generations. It became culture, tradition, common sense. And once something becomes common sense, it becomes invisible. You don't question it. You don't examine it. You just accept it. And that acceptance is the foundation of control.
There's a reason history doesn't teach you about these systems in detail. Not the mechanics, not the psychology. Because if you understood how they worked, you might start recognizing them. You might start seeing the same patterns in your own life, in your own society. And that recognition is dangerous. Not to you, to the system. Because once you see the cage, you can't unsee it. Once you understand how control works, it stops working. And that's the one thing every system of power fears most: awareness. The truth is, the most powerful prison is the one you don't realize you're in. Ancient rulers understood that. They built cages out of ideas, and those cages are still standing. You just call them something else now. You call them culture, tradition, the way things are, the way things have always been. But they haven't always been this way. Someone designed them, someone built them, someone benefits from them, and it's probably not you. So the next time someone tells you that's just how it is, ask yourself, who decided that? When did they decide it? And why do I believe them? Because the rulers without armies understood something fundamental about human nature. We don't need to be forced. We just need to be convinced. And once we're convinced, we'll do the work ourselves. We'll enforce the rules. We'll punish the rebels. We'll defend the system, even when it hurts us, especially when it hurts us. Because we've been taught that our suffering has meaning, that our obedience has purpose, that the system, despite its flaws, is the best we can do. But what if it's not? What if the cage is older than it needs to be? What if the rules are more fragile than they seem? What if the only thing holding the system together is your belief that it can't be changed? Ancient rulers knew that belief was stronger than steel, that fear was cheaper than armies, that control was easier when people chose it themselves. And they built empires on that knowledge, empires that fell. But the knowledge didn't fall with them. It just evolved, adapted, found new forms, new languages, new faces. And now you have to decide. Do you keep believing? Do you keep obeying? Do you keep defending a system that was designed by people who died thousands of years ago? Or do you start asking questions, start noticing patterns, start recognizing the invisible rules that shape your life?
Because the rulers without armies won. They controlled millions. They built civilizations. They created belief systems that outlived them by millennia. But they had one weakness, one vulnerability they could never eliminate. You. Your awareness. Your ability to see what's invisible. Your choice to stop accepting that's just how it is. The cage is real, but it's not made of steel. It's made of belief, and belief can change. The question is, will you change it? Or will you keep defending it, keep enforcing it, keep passing it to the next generation? The rulers are gone, but their systems remain, and you're the one keeping them alive.